field is everywhere, all around us, all the time, literally encompassing our surroundings, the buildings, landscapes, and urban patterns that shape our everyday lives. These buildings, these landscapes, they have tremendous amount of power. And the key lesson that I want to express to you today is that buildings represent power. The presence of any one building represents the absence of another. But I should say something about the type of architectural history I practice. I'm not exclusively interested in conventionally important buildings, like the Guggenheim Museum in New York, designed by the distinguished architect Frank Lloyd Wright, with its swirling atrium galleries and its horizontal body that mirrors the horizontality of the street. Now, I don't exclude this building. It's a fascinating building to understand and to analyze. It speaks to the power and prestige of the Guggenheim family that made its fortune mining lead, copper in the American West in Colorado. It also speaks to the power of culture to obscure the roots of that power and prestige. And as interesting as these buildings are to analyze, it's much more likely that you'd find me wandering the streets of Brooklyn looking at ordinary buildings. Because even though the Guggenheim represents power at an impressive scale, every building represents power in its own way. The presence of any one building represents the absence of something else. The built environment is an index, if you will, an index of power and agency that we can teach ourselves to read agency in the built environment at different scales. And this is what I've devoted myself to as an educator, is inviting my students to look around and ask these kinds of questions. The built environment is full of these hidden connections, if we can only invite ourselves and teach ourselves to see them. For example, 3 buildings that might have started their life at the same time, built in the same way, that have been updated at different moments in their history around different ideas of what it meant to be up to date. Or these decorated tenements from the 1890s, also in Brooklyn, whose diverging path might have gone to the extent of different paint colors at the cornice line and above the window trim. These buildings, these ordinary buildings, these everyday buildings, they make up the fabric, literally the fabric of our everyday lives. And they are part of a vernacular, a language of building that relates to a time and a place. Some vernacular architecture is very recognizable. You might see the Victorian row houses of San Francisco, or the cast iron buildings of Soho, for example, that are strongly associated with a time and place. New Haven also has its vernacular architecture, the rhythm of these Edwardian 2-family houses that mark so many of our neighborhoods, or these beautiful Romanesque row houses in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, for example. We can teach ourselves to see the way in which these buildings have been produced at a certain time and place. And the more we learn about architectural style and learn to familiarize ourselves with these buildings, the more we can understand when they were built and pull apart the layers and history of the city as it's being made over time. I invite you to train your eyes on even the smallest details in the built environment, like these relatively ordinary, and you would find them in almost every major industrial city, commercial buildings on a main street in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Looking at the Italianate window headers, for example, or the fancier features of the middle building, which is also adorned with this Masonic insignia above the middle window on the second floor there. These private buildings of the high industrial age asserting themselves on Main Street, attempting to assert the aspirations of their patrons and to grab your eyes and say, we belong here, we're citizens on this street. The more you look at these buildings and their efforts to ingratiate themselves, the more you hear them speaking and you begin to interpret them. Just as cities, private industry in cities, the high tide of industrialization created waves of building and development in cities, we also follow the path of the public landscape and the public patronage of buildings. For example, New Deal post offices, which were built by the hundreds during the 1930s, and the WPA murals that are often found on the inside. This is a very typical colonial revival post office from Winstead, Connecticut. The mural is actually kind of interesting. This shows an emissary of President Lincoln's Postmaster General who's trying to decide, I love the self-referential quality of it, he's trying to decide where will they locate the post office. And he has three people from Winsted imploring him: the farmer who wants it put near the fields, the mechanic who wants it near the factories, and then the Main Street proprietor behind him who wants to place it right on Main Street. And in doing so, highlighting the kind of tripartite structure of Winstead's economy. But we have to always look beyond the singular building. It's not just the post office or the Winstead Town Hall, which might be considered more official buildings. It's the ordinary structure of Papa's Market, which was probably built around 1970, around a totally different paradigm of building. Not addressing the street as a kind of citizen, but stepping back to allow for cars to park there. And we begin to see the power of the automobile and the power of infrastructure and paradigms of mobility affecting the built environment. I find myself looking closely at these buildings and attempting to interpret them, the field being the making and meaning of all of these places. As fascinating as the Guggenheim Museum may be, I'm just as drawn to this simple industrial building on Lorimer Street in Brooklyn, and I imagine the enterprising bricklayer deciding to ennoble the door of this very modest building with an image of a triumphal Roman arch, simply because he could. And you can follow these buildings over time. You can see the impact of the taggers, who also want to leave their mark on the landscape. Agency is deployed at different scales across the landscape, and we teach ourselves to read them in order to tell stories about the making, meaning, and change of these places. I've gone back to this building many times, and I almost always take a picture. A couple years after the first slide, this building gets politicized, responding to its environment, and we are literally reading the text of this building. But more recently, it seems that the building has been depoliticized. The arch has gone mute. It's even harder to see, although the political aspects of this building are retained on the second floor. We trace these buildings over time, even with our own footsteps through the city, watching them change and interpreting them as we go. As my late advisor from the University of California, Berkeley, Paul Groth, the geographer and architectural historian, would say, the walls of the city speak, we only need to teach ourselves to read them. He would say Americans are like fish that can't see the water. We're constantly being surrounded by these structures that influence our social norms, are taken for granted, that assert power, that can reproduce inequality, and yet we take them for granted. We need to invite ourselves to look at them and analyze them. Sometimes we can't take the text at face value. There are a lot of empty signifiers in our built environment, especially in fast gentrifying neighborhoods like Brooklyn. You can't get hot bagels at the Grand Bakery anymore because it's not the Grand Bakery. It's a small boutique that is selling authentic workwear, actually attempting to draw on the authenticity of the working class neighborhood that it in some way indirectly replaced. But too sophisticated, of course, to remove the sign itself, which is a sign of their appreciation for the old neighborhood and wanting to participate in it. You can't get a haircut in the unisex salon anymore, but you can buy vinyl to play on your LP. Again, the analog technology, another kind of gentrifying aesthetic, wanting to keep the sign and yet the store underneath it changes its functions. There are times when very powerful forces act on the landscape. Massive corporations like the Prudential Insurance Company, large public authorities like the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority, which collaborated on the Prudential Center in Boston. I wrote an entire book analyzing the power dynamics behind this type of landscape and understanding its impact on post-war urban change, which was a moment of dramatic urban change where highways are being laced through our cities and large corporations are deciding where and how they will invest in the city. We have our own version in New Haven with the Knights of Columbus building and the New Haven Veterans Memorial Coliseum sitting adjacent to the Oak Street Connector, New Haven's own mid-century urban highway. The Knights of Columbus being a Catholic fraternal order as well as a major insurance company, and the New Haven Veterans Memorial Coliseum being the civic program of this ensemble. Now, the Coliseum itself was torn down in 2008, and I'm going to return to this site briefly. But the power of the planners who are intervening with the highway, the power of the Knights of Columbus to sponsor such a prominent building in this new landscape, and then the voice of the city itself, the public landscape of the Coliseum. We see change as we walk through the streets and return to different places over time. And we also research urban change when we're at our desks or in the library and we're back from the field with historical maps like the Sanborn Paris Company fire insurance maps. These are incredible documents. I'm personally obsessed with them and could spend almost all my time just looking at them because there's innumerable hidden connections and stories that are embedded in these maps, which are coded by the color and materiality, yellow for wood, pink for brick, blue for stone, brown for fireproof buildings. And if we line them up over time, we can also read agency and power and how cities are changing. In this case, this is Chapel in York, we're seeing at least in part the way Yale as an institution is exerting its power of acquiring properties and building out the center of its campus. The Sterling Memorial Quadrangle coming online around 1919, and of course over the course of the 30s and 40s, many of the other colleges being built. And of course we see Chapel Street between 1901 and 1923 becoming a much more dense commercial district, and by 1973, of course, that's all gone. It's now the site of the Yale University Art Gallery. Yale as the major agent of change now that we can excavate through observing these Sanborn maps at different moments in time. But they couldn't produce a map like this every single year. You know, the Sanborn Company is hiring these surveyors to go out in city after city, even incredibly remote mining cities. They have Sanborn surveyors that were out there drawing in detail every little building that they found on the ground. They might issue one of these large sheets of paper, they're about this big, and then send the surveyor around to mark the changes, write them on small pieces of paper, and paste them over. Where we're literally seeing the urban landscape as a kind of text, and what kind of text? A palimpsest that's written, rewritten, overwritten, partially erased, and written again. This map from Crown Street at Howe shows the original map of New Haven in 1923 with updates up to 1960, and you begin to see the influence of the automobile with the filling station on the corner and buildings that have been removed to make for surface parking. It's two moments in the city's history being demonstrated or illustrated at the same time. It's the same type of process, you might say, that we can observe in certain buildings that accrue change over time. These residences, these dwellings, that as the owners of them began to relate to the changing quality of the streets around them, from more residential to more commercial, instead of tearing down and building a commercial building, just does a commercial bump out, a little commercial appendage, which allows them to keep the original and produce a new kind of structure with a new program on the street itself. Again, two moments in time in a single building in this way, and showing a kind of small-scale agency of the owner to be able to adapt to those urban conditions. Because a lot of what I want to do is to invite people to see these things and to think about these things. I work with students to produce media intended for public audiences that are supposed to describe and explain these types of processes. And so working with one of my students, and I have some of these for those of you who want them at the end, we produced a newspaper about these Frankenstein buildings, how to spot them, and even drawing the permutations of how the original houses change over time to become these new commercial bump-out Frankenstein buildings. And as we begin to study individual buildings, my students, we collect all of this material in the New Haven Building Archive, which has now hundreds of portraits of local buildings, excavating each one individually over time, tracing its physical changes as well as the social changes within them, using city directories, telephone books, maps, to understand who lived there, their professions, and how the functions of that building may have changed over time. In New Haven today, we're in the midst of dramatic change. And I think many of you see it all around. For those of us who've been in the city for some time, it's incredibly striking. There is a tremendous amount of development of new housing, which we call 5/1 housing, because it's about 5 stories of stick frame, 2x4s and plywood, over 1 or 2 stories of a concrete podium. It's become a new vernacular, if you will, a new language of building that developers have developed, have arrived at in cities like New Haven. This, for example, is the site of the Coliseum building. Torn down in 2008 because it was allowed to decay. Maintenance was deferred. The city wasn't investing any money in the building. It was a surface parking lot for years, and now finally, in this moment of a housing boom, we're seeing it being invested in and built in again with this new type of housing. So of course we wanted to produce a newspaper that would explore this trend in the environment, which is incredibly striking. Hundreds and hundreds of new units being built all over the city in this new vernacular that we can again analyze by looking carefully at the buildings themselves. As New Haven is changing, and as we're seeing all of these new buildings with new dwellers and new arrivals to the city of New Haven, we're also in threat of losing many of the older, interesting buildings that give New Haven its sense of place, including in particular a lot of the industrial heritage of New Haven. Buildings that have lost their modus operandi, where the patron has already left the scene, and no new agent, no new client, no new user has yet come to fill that space. They are being they are absent of the new capital investment that will give them a new lease on life. If these buildings were in a place like Brooklyn, we might find that users have moved in much more readily. But in a place like New Haven, that pace of change is much slower. And we can lose some of these buildings. The Bigelow Boiler buildings that I show in this photograph were torn down 2 years ago because they were allowed to deteriorate. There was no stewardship program that the city was attempting to run that would provide for funding to mothball or secure these buildings to allow them to have a new future. And in that absence, the building has come down. And the building like the New Haven Clock Company on Hamilton Street in New Haven, it has also had a very nebulous status and has been a threat at many times in its existence. But now it appears that the New Haven Housing Authority will step in as the new patron. So the same building, well-built buildings, can go on to have many different lives and to reflect urban change within the structure itself. It was because of the loss of Bigelow and the difficulty of redeveloping the Clock Company that a number of us got involved with the Gough Street Armory in New Haven, which had also been allowed to lie fallow, a building that was built by the state of Connecticut, transferred to the city of New Haven once the National Guard, for whom it was built, left the building, but then allowed to disintegrate, holes allowed to let water in, creating a tremendous amount of damage, sitting for about 15 years with nothing going on inside the building itself. Not wanting to lose a building as interesting and substantial as this, it started as an inquiry with my students to explore the history of the building, to engage people in the spaces of the building with this wonderful model. We had a team of 6-year-old consultants helping us think about the building at these events, and inviting adults to imagine new futures of this place. This effort continued at the Armory Community Garden, of which I am a dedicated gardener. The gardeners and the events we would hold there became a place to organize around the future of the Gough Street Armory, of explaining its importance, of talking about its tremendous potential, and trying to get neighbors and citizens interested in this building. In other words, inviting people to find their own agency in the future of cities and to take some responsibility for the buildings around them. This is the issue with the built environment. It often appears natural, and so it's all there. You know, what can I really do? Maybe I can make small-scale interventions. Maybe I can repaint, or maybe I can do a different kind of landscaping. There's ways in which we can contribute as individuals. But when we come together and when we find those hidden connections in our own communities, we can organize to make stronger change and to advocate for large buildings like this and to try to bring them back online. Obviously, I became a newspaper publisher in all of this once again, producing more ephemera around these buildings as part of our effort to reach out and invite people to look carefully at the building and to think about how it could be adapted and reused. We parlayed this into a series of public meetings that our community group organized, always with the help of my students from Yale College and the Yale School of Architecture, but me acting essentially as a citizen, organizing with my fellow gardeners and other neighbors and community members around the armory itself. Basically making a fuss, saying we won't allow this building to be neglected. We won't allow this building to be taken down like the Bigelow Boiler buildings, and getting people engaged in this, and again, finding their collective agency around the building itself. And I'm very happy to say that these efforts have finally given us some traction on the Armory. We were able to write and receive a large planning grant from the state of Connecticut, and now the state of Connecticut has given New Haven an even bigger community investment fund grant that is paying for the remediation of this structure. And there are now consultants that are helping us imagine the way in which the spaces can be adapted to new uses. It's going to be very interesting to see how the community group responds to all of this, adapts to all of this, and continues to make sure that we push the values that we've arrived at in many of our public meetings, that it should be inclusive, an engine of opportunity, that it should be sustainable, and that it should be a source of community pride. Buildings represent power. The presence of the building represents the wherewithal of the patron to build it in the first place. Buildings represent, as we see them on streets, different scales of agency, from the builders building a row of 3 tenements at one period of time, to the bricklayer attempting to assert his own creativity around a fancy brick triumphal arch. Buildings represent power. They are indices of power that we can teach ourselves to see. But the hidden connections come about when we choose to pull ourselves together and to organize around buildings that we want to preserve as important public spaces and to serve important civic uses. And so with that in mind, I thank you very much. Keep looking up and keep finding those hidden connections. Thank you.